What's up, guys? I was looking into the Arch of Titus for completely different reasons and wound up going off in the deep end in this direction. So, I'm about to show you how our history really works and how a famous historical event that's still important and has real world ramifications today all comes from the writings of one guy, Flavius Josephus, and his version alone of what happened to ancient Jerusalem. As the story goes, around 70 AD, the Romans laid siege and they tore the whole city apart, evidently, to where some of it is, 20 feet down below street level and looking like this. I said it before and I'll say it again. After spending months laying siege, how do you even convince your troops to, hey, don't worry about the gold, don't worry about the silver, don't break open the casks of wine and celebrate. No, let's spend the next 2 years tearing this city apart. We're looking at the paving stones of the street here, so they literally tore everything apart, really. Well, Josephus's description does say that after the Romans were done, you couldn't recognize it as a city ever being there. This is modern day archaeological work 20 feet below the street level. This is supposed to be the pilgrim's path from the ritual cleansing pool up to the Temple Mount. But the more you dig into this, the more you wonder, is this even the right city we're talking about? So let's just go at this step by step. So I just got done looking into some of these ancient arches that still survive, the Arch of Constantine here, and the Arch of Septimius Severus. And we've got old paintings dating back to the 1600s showing that these were buried about 15 feet up from the bottom to where half the plinth is covered. And a very noticeable design feature of the ancient arches are that there's 3 arches, and I would say that these have a utilitarian function. These were placed in certain areas of the city and were basically used as admission gates. You pass through one of these to get to the Colosseum, for instance. So I would say that one of these were for full-fledged Roman citizens, which was a big deal, and these are the guys that bypass all of the velvet ropes at the nightclub. They just walk right in. The large one in the center were for letting in goods and wagons and whatnot. And then the third arch were, well, you got to show your tickets, so you got to show why you're supposed to be in here, papers please. And then you've got the Arch of Titus, just this one single opening, and this was supposed to be of a conquest that was so full of riches that it paid for the Colosseum. So why did his triumphal arch get shortchanged? Did they spend all the money on the Colosseum? Well, looking into this, I came across quite a few interesting things. First off, you guys have had a good look at this now. Let's rewind a couple hundred years, and this is what the old paintings show as the Arch of Titus. A lot of the details don't match what we see today, but most notably is the fact that the left and right walls are going up at a steep angle but not vertical. And evidently this is what it still looked like in 1744. Now I want to point out that a certain banking dynasty that translates to Red Shield and was of a certain group of people was probably just being born about the time that this was painted. I know he passed in 1812. And I gotta be subtle here just because of the way the world works. If you don't know why, ask Kanye. But this arch pictured here is not this arch that is there today. And according to HistoryHit.com, they say that the Arch of Titus provided a model for many arches built after the 16th century, most notably the Arc de Triomphe. Just so you know, this wasn't built till 1806 was when construction started, the Napoleonic Wars. So this is a pretty modern construction. Napoleonic France was also the first country in Europe to give full citizenship to certain people. Now, I'll just say the Hebes, the ancient 12 tribes, and I'm not saying anything bad about anybody. This is just the way it is. So on Titus's arch, you have this relief carved on it celebrating the ancient, supposedly 79 AD conquest of Jerusalem. But let's zoom out and take a look at that whole piece of artwork there. What's up with all these holes in it? Well, the official history of this is that in the Middle Ages, somebody decided to add a second floor to the arch because it makes perfect sense to add an extra floor here at this level, right? Well, okay, that explains the holes there that are totally in no way where they chiseled out and pry-barred this relief off of a different location. So just a quick recap. It looked like this in 1744. It looks like this today. And it has this carved panel in there that totally was not pried off from somewhere else and stuck here. We all on the same page? Good. Because this is where it actually starts to get interesting. A second arch of Titus has been found. And the thing about that is archaeologists can't recall any other case where two arches were built to celebrate the same victory. And to explain this, they say the second one was for his post-mortem deification, and this other one was a proper triumphal arch with the three arches like I showed in the beginning. You can see one of the bases of the huge columns right here in an area that's prone to flooding. And this is all buried under a pretty much level valley field here. Now they go on more about the reason this second arch was built and how the dedication inscription hasn't survived, but it was transcribed by an anonymous 9th century pilgrim. Seriously. So an anonymous pilgrim for 1100 years ago says, following the advice and direction of his father, subdued the Hebe people and destroyed the holy city. Something which all other generals, kings, and peoples before him had not even attempted or had failed to accomplish. Now, I'm pretty sure there's no inscription anywhere hyping up the Visigoths or the Carthaginians, Hannibal at the gates, but it was these guys that were unconquerable. I mean, they're definitely world-renowned for their physical prowess. That's why you see so many of them in the NBA and NFL. I mean, it's not like they're bankers and lawyers or anything. So I'm sure back in the day they were formidable warriors, and the Romans were probably pretty scared of them. We'll get back to this arch in a minute, but this is the only time in history archaeologists have found two separate arches dedicated to the same person for the same event. Which brings us to Josephus, the only source of this event. And I'll just tell you, historians kind of snicker when they say his name. It's kind of an open secret that everybody's just like, okay, yeah, we actually use this guy as a reliable historical source. Even this woodcut we're looking at, it came from the 19th century, and I actually run into this a lot. Hundreds or even, in this case, thousands of years after the person supposedly lived, someone will decide to do a portrait of them. And you got to understand, somebody is paying the artist to do this. And the only reason I can think of is to further their authenticity. This is a mess, so let's just start right here. Everything we know about Josephus comes from Josephus himself. And this paragraph is a rather modest description. A scion of a priestly family, Josephus became a rebel general at the start of the war. He was captured by Vespasian, who was there to quell the rebellion. And Josephus predicted correctly that Vespasian would be the future emperor of Rome. And so Josephus witnessed the final stages of the siege safely from the Roman camp. Like I said, that was a really modest description because according to Josephus about himself, he was the best general and was put in charge of the north wall because that was the direction they were coming from. And it's a fishing story. You know how the fish keeps getting bigger and bigger with every telling. But I found a short video that, he wrote like 7 books about this and goes into great detail about the siege. But the Cliff Notes go something like this. The Romans had finally breached one of the walls, and as they filed into the city, all of the rebels were laying in wait for them. So the rebels jumped out with a surprise attack, and those stupid Romans that don't know anything about sieging a city didn't realize there was only a small hole in the wall to get out of, so they slaughtered all of them. Then, emboldened by this, they ran out and attacked the Romans, and Romans suffered heavy casualties. And it goes on and on about how strong the rebels were. And then when it got to this part, I just started laughing. So the rebels started tunneling out, which that isn't strange. This happens in siege warfare all the time because sieges they can last for years and years. But it's usually the invading army that tunnels into the place that they have under siege. But Josephus says those wily rebels, they tunneled out underneath the Roman siege engines. Then they lit the supports on fire and it all collapsed underneath them. And once again, the Romans had fatally underestimated the defenders. I got a bridge for sale with a great view of the bay if anybody's interested. Long story short, the Romans took on heavy casualties, but they finally sacked the city and they destroyed the Second Temple. Just so you know, this is what the city looked like in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And today they'll tell you that this is the most fought over, most heavily contested piece of land on Earth. But 150 years ago, it seems like a quaint little city inhabited predominantly by these guys with only a few of these guys. But back to Josephus, the Hebes were hardly aware this book even existed until the Renaissance. And then it became an important source for recovering their history. I probably should have done the Renaissance video first, that's what I was researching, but this got me sidetracked. Everyone's history comes from the Renaissance period. But Josephus and his two big works are just a couple of the many books that all of a sudden reappeared out of nowhere during the Renaissance after 1,000 years. His other big work is the Antiquities of the Hebes, which they use the word antiquities like we use the word history. They're just saying the history of. So Josephus was supposed to have lived in the 1st century AD, which is why you find drawings of him in 1493. And he is the sole source of the sacking of ancient Jerusalem and the destruction of the Second Temple, and also the history of those people before that, before the 1st century AD. And his book was unknown to the Hebes of the Renaissance period, which, by the way, they had been missing for about 1,000 years. On most videos, maybe about 5% of what I've learned actually goes into the video. In this case, since I was too tired to record, about 1%, because I've listened to 20, 30 hours of lectures about this. So I actually wrote down a quote from this lecture, because I forgot they have transcripts. But he says this: "The Talmud happens to be our best source for how the Talmud came to be. Much like Josephus, we are held hostage to Josephus for the 1st century, the history of the 1st century and what happened. We are held hostage to the Talmud for the history of the Talmud." So not only is Josephus the sole source of what he claims happened, but also everything that's in the Talmud is the only source of that information. Now let's go to a different source of information, the Seekers of Unity channel. I like a lot, great philosophy channel. And he starts one of his videos with, "What if I told you that the Hebes' greatest philosopher believed that the ancient mystery tradition with all of her secrets had been lost to the sands of time, and that he had taken it upon himself to reconstruct them on his own from scratch?" Now he's talking about Moses Maimonides, who's a famous mystic of the Middle Ages, the Renaissance. Anybody else starting to see a pattern here? But wait, it keeps going. If you guys haven't figured out that the world was basically reset in the 13th, 14th century, then you've been listening to too many people that look at pictures. There's a wealth of knowledge, no matter what avenue you take, that shows the progress of humanity since then. But you hit a dead end going backwards in time around 700-800 years ago. So it should be no surprise that the Kabbalah emerged from earlier forms of mysticism in the 12th to 13th century, and then was reinterpreted during the mystical renaissance of the 16th century in Ottoman Palestine. The Zohar, the main foundational text, was composed in the late 13th century. And really what happens is everything gets spread out over a couple hundred years, so it doesn't look like it was all rewritten at one specific time, but it was. And now the final nail in the coffin that ties all this together. The menorah pictured on the Arch of Titus acted as a template for the emblem of the state of Izzy. And the Arch of Titus itself provided a model for all of the arches that were built after the 16th century. So this arch that used to look like this, and obviously got remodeled into this, served as a model to build other arches during the Renaissance and beyond. And this bas relief totally was not chiseled out of a different area and stuck here. And interestingly enough, the Hebes of the time had no idea what Moses' candlestick looked like until they saw it carved in this relief. This is held in very high regard today. It's the emblem of the nation, but they didn't know what it even looked like 500 years ago. But let's zoom in closer, and it's pretty badly damaged, but is this Roman soldiers that we're looking at? I don't see any armor or even the famous Roman sandals. So is this really even a depiction of the Romans carrying off spoils of war? What I do notice is everybody's wearing headbands, and it's not the laurel wreath like you'd see on a statue of Julius Caesar. But here you can see that it's tied all the way around. And it looks suspiciously like the headbands that are known to have been worn by the ancient Hebes. So is this really a depiction of Romans carrying off the spoils of war? Well, we've got historical accounts from one eyewitness only that says that, yeah, that's the way it happened. And his books magically resurface during the Renaissance period, around the time the Kabbalah emerged from earlier forms of itself, and around the time Moses Maimonides took it upon himself to reconstruct the ancient mysteries from scratch. But don't worry, we've got the ancient coins to prove it, because instead of making weapons that would have been worth something, the ancient Hebes decided to print coins because they knew the Romans were likely to destroy the city, but they believed that one day their descendants would return. They knew they'd be kicked out of the city. They knew this before it even happened. But they knew their descendants in a couple thousand years would return and they would find these coins. I would love to go into the Khazari and how what's happening over in Eastern Europe right now is just them getting rid of the people that live there to make a new nation in their actual historical homeland. But I'll be lucky if I even am able to get this video out the way it is right now. So I hope it was educational for you guys. If you liked it, hit the like button, subscribe, whatever. Static out.